Now I scandal. Thank you for being here, and those that are online. Hopefully they don't break this. Welcome to the Seneca-Iroquois Cultural Center. Welcome back. Super excited. My name is Hayden Haynes. I'm the director here, but I'm super excited to hear Ms. Nuckles talk tonight, and particularly interests me in some of the work that Erica does down at the Westmoreland Museum, which I've had an opportunity to go down there a couple times and do some work with Erica. If you haven't had a chance to visit the Westmoreland, it's a beautiful space down by Pittsburgh. What I liked about what she was doing down there is taking a lot of that, which is primarily just American, non-Indigenous art that they have in their collections, and offering an opportunity for Native peoples to provide a different perspective on those pieces. So, for example, there was a portrait of George Washington that's in their collection. So, there's the description of George Washington as it's written for the piece. It's a beautiful piece, and then there's an opportunity to, next to it, have an Indigenous perspective about our thoughts or our memories and relationships with Mr. Washington. So that contrast I thought was really smart and really good, and I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for other places to do work like that. But I'm particularly interested in listening to her talk tonight because it's going to give a glimpse, right, from a female perspective, as is written in the description, about a life during the French and Indian War. And so, as we all know by now, much of that history, right, is written by men, and women were either omitted completely or erased from those topics and stories. So, to have this account is really important. I'm excited to hear it. And without further ado, Ms. Erica Nuckles.
Thank you so much, Hayden. Thanks for joining us, for those joining us in person here, and for those online. And yeah, it's been awesome working with Hayden and doing many different projects with him, including, and I will image here, a very special installation that he was talking about. It's called Creating Common Memory. It's up right now in our galleries. And we invited Hayden through his individual perspective to be able to share interpretations of works in our permanent collection, and including this work, which some people are familiar with. This is a painting by Robert Griffin, who is a current artist that lives in Western Pennsylvania. He does a lot of historical paintings. He really is a historian. He just uses art to tell history. This one is of Braddock's defeat, which I'll talk a little bit about today during my presentation. It's actually one of the favorite paintings that we have among our visitors at the museum. And it was one of the first ones when we did started the Creating Common Memory project together that Hayden and I really connected with, because it is showing mainly the British Army and just men, mostly white men, and it doesn't really show, unless you look really closely in the background, the many, many different Native warriors that were the victors of this battle, which was one of the greatest Native American victories of all time. Also missing from this, from my perspective of what I study with gender and war, are the many women who were caught in the middle of this too. Primarily white women that were a part of the British Army, but there also were likely some black women there too. So I think we both really loved working on Creating Common Memory, because we are trying to bring to light those stories that from groups that have been traditionally marginalized throughout the writing of history. So I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity to share with you the subject of my dissertation. And thank you, Hayden, for letting me revisit an old friend, Charlotte Browne, who I'll share some of her story with you today. And I hope you enjoy learning a little bit about her very extraordinary experience and a very rare female account of someone who is involved in the French and Indian War in a very unique way. In the fall of 1754, 30-year-old Charlotte Browne prepared to embark on a journey from London to Virginia as part of General Edward Braddock's forces during the early stages of the French and Indian War. She had accepted a position as matron of the British Army's General Hospital. A young mother and widow of middling rank, she bid farewell to her 3 children left in the care of her family in London, uncertain if or when she would see them again. This was not her first journey to North America with the British Army, but it would be her last. Browne left a personal account of her service during the French and Indian War in the form of a journal. And the image I have here is from a copy of the journal at the Library of Congress, which was the first version of her journal I was exposed to when I was living in D.C., working on my master's degree. It was my first trip to the Library of Congress, was to look up this journal and see what I had sort of heard little bits and pieces about, and if there was really anything worthy to explore within it, which boy there was. And you can also check out the actual journal. It's at the New York Historical Society, and it's also digitized online. So I encourage you to check that out as well. Additionally, there are other sources directly associated with her that help to illuminate her identity and experiences before and after the period of her journal. Yet, typical of many women's histories of this era, gaps in her story remain. To understand the significance of Browne's life, particularly her experience as matron during the French and Indian War, requires delving into the context of her life as a British woman of middling ranks with familial ties to the Army and London. Born Charlotte Bristow in 1724, Browne was the middle of 5 children and the eldest daughter. She had 3 brothers, Robert, James, and Richard, and 1 sister, Rachel. Their parents, Mary and James, had all 5 Bristow children baptized in the Anglican Church, specifically St. Michael's in Betchworth, Surrey, outside of London. While little is known about her childhood, the major influences on her life were the same as her female contemporaries. British women were dependent on men during the 18th century. Their upbringing and education, formal or not, were designed to train them to be proper wives and mothers, able to run a household. So Browne was taught that love, self-sacrifice, duty, and subordination were central to a woman's role in society. These ideal female characteristics would challenge and guide Browne's life in extraordinary ways, as would her social rank. 18th century British society was highly stratified. It was a system rooted in the medieval belief in a divinely ordained, static social order. Based on occupation, the system placed the majority of the population, or commonalty, that performed manual, unskilled labor at its base. In contrast, the more exclusive landed nobility held financial and political power over the masses from the apex of the social structure. But existing in between these 2 groups were the growing number of middling sorts that performed more skilled labor or maintained employment in the professions. And the occupations of Browne's 2 brothers, Richard the grocer and Robert the apothecary, were typical of the middling ranks, their training acquired through apprenticeship. Browne's eldest brother, Robert Bristow, received his commission as master apothecary in the British Army in 1745 at the age of 24. and was stationed in North America during the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s. The North American portion of the conflict was known as King George's War, and it was the third in a series of French and Indian wars fought to determine British, French, and American Indian control and influence in North America. In 1745, provincial troops from New England, under the command of Sir William Pepperell, successfully took the French fortress town of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia after a 6-week siege. Following the victory, the British Army and its administration oversaw this prize of war. And this is a wonderfully recreated historic site if you ever get a chance to go up to Nova Scotia. It's very beautiful. So I highly recommend the Fortress Louisbourg. The war provided an opportunity for Robert Bristow, who was ordered to serve at Louisbourg's hospital, as well as his sister Charlotte, who accompanied him to Nova Scotia. It was likely there that Charlotte went from being a Bristow to a Browne. Charlotte Browne was married in the mid-1740s to Edward Browne, who served as the clerk of check during the British occupation of Louisbourg from 1745 to 1748. As clerk of check, a civilian position established to enforce financial control in the British Army, Edward Browne's duty was to submit muster rolls, lists of men in active service, periodically throughout the year. In addition, he sought supplies for the garrison of Louisbourg through merchants such as Thomas Hancock of Boston. In order to fulfill his duty, Edward Browne was in direct contact with the hospital at Louisbourg because an important aspect of his job was to keep track of absentee soldiers, including those who were sick or wounded. The hospital provided a frequent point of contact between Edward Browne and members of the hospital staff, including the apothecary Robert Bristow and his sister Charlotte, who served in an unknown capacity. The Brownes may have married in London prior to departing for Louisbourg, but they also may have married while stationed in Nova Scotia. If the former were the case, the couple may have met in London during peacetime operations of the British Army and its administration. However, it seems more likely that Browne may have met her husband in Louisbourg while assisting her brother in the hospital. The presence of Robert Bristow at Louisbourg, a suitable guardian for his young, single sister, supports the idea that Browne may have married at Louisbourg. Further evidence for this comes from a colleague of Browne's at Louisbourg named Miss Miller, with whom Browne reconnected nearly a decade after their time in Nova Scotia, and who declared that she had known Browne as maid, wife, and widow. While stationed in Nova Scotia, the couple began a family, and Browne was around 24 years old when she gave birth to her first child on May 20th, 1748, a daughter, Mary Louisa, who was named after her maternal grandmother, and who was born just before the end of the War of Austrian Succession. As part of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle that effectively ended the conflict, Louisbourg was returned to the French, and the young family resided in Louisbourg during the transition back to French control. But by 1750, they had moved to the peacetime garrison at British-controlled Placentia in Newfoundland. I'm just always astounded at her getting married and then starting a family in these very remote places. For the young Browne family, Placentia was a drastic change from the fortress city at Louisbourg. While both garrisons were a far cry from the metropolis of London, Louisbourg was much larger than Placentia and had a diversity of buildings and amenities to support its population. Placentia, on the other hand, was a small, isolated fishing village with an unruly reputation that led to the construction of a prison and gallows when the Browne family resided there. They joined a garrison that when it first arrived in 1748 to Placentia, consisted of one company of the Newfoundland Regiment and a detachment of the Royal Artillery that were ill-supplied. And it was quite the shift from the 700 soldiers that had been at Louisburg. Edward Browne served as keeper of the rolls in which he worked to supply Placentia's troops from merchants in British North America. And while stationed at Placentia, the Browne family continued to grow with the birth of another daughter, Charlotte, on December 15th of 1750, and a son, Edward, on March 7th, 1753. It is unknown if Browne worked in the hospital while at Placentia. We learn about these different things through like a family Bible that listed some of like the births and deaths. So we don't quite know what she was doing, but it does seem likely she did lend a hand. I'm always hopeful some other journal of hers will pop up at some point from these times prior to the French and Indian War. Even in times of peace, a garrison still had injuries and illness to address, so she may have been working in the hospital there. But she also would have been very busy managing her own household and caring for her growing family. Many middling women continued working as they entered motherhood, their duty to their children aided by the assistance of a servant or female family members. Starting and raising a family at military garrisons was likely challenging and unlike Browne's own upbringing in London, and it was about to become even more difficult. On May 6, 1753, shortly after the birth of his only son, Edward Browne died of unknown causes in Placentia at the age of 38. His wife was left to care for an infant, a toddler, and a 5-year-old. The decisions Browne made to support her children offer a unique perspective on the ambiguous situation of widowhood in British society. Widows during this period trod a fine line between the public realm and the more private sphere of the home. Unmarried women and widows held the status of femme sole, which allowed for greater rights and independence than their married sisters. Masculine rights, such as property ownership, head of household status, and legal standing in terms of creating contracts and conducting business. Yet widows were distinct even from those older, single women with whom they shared the privileges of femme sole, because a widow had had experience as a wife and, of particular concern to proper British society, sexual experience. So therefore, literature of the period depicts the ideal widow in terms such as sober, grave, temperate, honest, faithful, charitable, modest, chaste, kind, virtuous, and pious, that lived a solitary private life. While less ideal widows were stereotyped, largely as a response to their ambiguous legal status, as deceptive, wanton, angry, scheming, haughty, sorrowful, pitiful, discontented, odious, and sinful. The behavior and actions of independent women, including widows, were under particular scrutiny as they were considered to be a threat to the social order. Age and motherhood influenced the choices made by widows in the 18th century. Upon becoming a widow, Browne gained a legal identity, but also the burden of solely caring for her family as a woman. The social status of men, which was more fixed than that of women regardless of marital status, remained virtually unchanged when their spouse died. Regardless, widowers were more likely to enter another marriage than widows. Older widows over the age of 50 were encouraged to remain dignified in widowhood, whereas young widows were more likely to remarry, particularly if they had young children to support. But Browne bucked this trend. As a young widow with young children, she never remarried. Widows who remained unmarried were in a unique position to define or redefine their norms and construct or reconstruct their world in response to both the prescriptive literature directed toward them and the actual circumstances in which they found themselves. Browne's femme sole status permitted her to choose the path that allowed her to support her children financially. She needed to provide them with the maintenance, protection, and education suitable to their rank and determined by English common law. It was essential for her to return to her family in London. The London Browne returned to after several years across the Atlantic was a bustling metropolis that covered 10,000 acres and contained around 750,000 inhabitants, a dramatic contrast from Louisburg and Placentia. Her brother Richard and probably her parents and other siblings lived in the vicinity of the adjacent neighborhoods of Cheapside and Cornhill. And the area would have looked different to Browne upon her return to London because there had been a major fire in that section of the city that had destroyed much of the area near the Royal Exchange while she had been in Louisburg in 1748. Her adopted parish, St. Benet-Finck, had survived the fire and was located on Threadneedle Street in Cornhill within the area of her brother's place of business. And I love maps and trying to figure out like where they lived and connecting all of these different, documents, figuring out who her, especially with the last name Browne, was quite challenging. But it seems to be this is where her family lived. So Richard Bristow's grocery was situated on Bread Street in Cheapside, an area of London traditionally known for its markets and produce, a fact reflected in street names like Bread Street, Poultry, Fish Street Hill, Garlic Hill, and Pudding Lane. But Browne's reunion with the Bristows in London was, of course, bittersweet. Her family was introduced to its newest members, but also faced the dilemma of assisting Browne with the upbringing of her children. Because of the help and support of her family, Browne could provide for her children without sacrificing her social standing and remain an ideal widow who administered her estate or trade so as to maximize the benefits for her children, especially for her sons, and to facilitate their education, apprenticeship, if any, and eventual entry into business on their own account. Had she remained in London, her story would be more typical, but renewed trouble between the British and French in their North American colonies disrupted any sense of normalcy for the widow Browne. Browne's decision to leave her children to serve as matron of the British Army's General Hospital in North America during the opening stages of the French and Indian War was exceptional, outside of social norms, and may have been viewed as perplexing to some of her fellow Britons. Was she in search of a husband in the same manner as she had found her first spouse? Was she simply seeking adventure in a time and place where there were few options for women to pursue such an endeavor? Browne never recorded her reasoning, yet her actions, while unusual, show that she was not trying to be exceptional, and that she was instead attempting to be an ideal mother and widow. Her decision to leave her children in order to support them was a difficult one, yet it seems based on her devotion to their well-being, along with the cooperation, support, and connections of her parents and siblings, particularly her eldest brother, Robert Bristow, with whom she had traveled to Louisburg during the War of Austrian Succession. As the Army's General Hospital sought a matron, Browne's brother once again played an influential role in his sister's life. The close relationship they had as brother and sister was common among middling and upper rank families in the 18th century because they did not have to compete for an inheritance as brothers often did. But the connection between these particular Bristow siblings went even deeper because of their specific positions in the Army's General Hospital. Traditionally, a male apothecary and female matron worked closely together, and this is just generally in hospitals within British society. Traditionally, and they worked so closely, it was almost as if they were in a domestic partnership to be able to oversee the daily operations of the hospital. The apothecary had received training through an apprenticeship, whereas women in the medical field typically did not receive formal training with the exception of midwives. The matron was the senior female member of the hospital staff and had a wide range of duties, both medical and clerical. She was in charge of the supervision of the staff, managing patients, and the procurement of provisions, furniture, and household goods. Browne would have gained relevant experience as the sister of an apothecary who had likely been assisting in the Army's hospitals at the Fortress Louisbourg and Placentia. Her family connections, upstanding character, and practical hospital experience made Browne an ideal candidate for the position of matron when another war with France seemed imminent in 1754. The timing was right for Browne, allowing her an occupation by which she could support her children, even if it required being physically absent from their young lives. After bidding farewell to her children, Browne and her brother, along with a manservant and a maid, set off with General Edward Braddock's fleet aboard the ship London on November 17, 1754. Their ship, laden with stores for the hospital, also boarded soldiers, officers, and their wives. Browne commented about her accommodations on board. She writes, "Went into my new cabin. Mrs. Barboot, an officer's lady, came on board and took the one next to mine." Having been given equal lodging to an officer's wife, Browne was grouped among the elevated ranks. However, several days later, Browne reveals the specific location of she and Mrs. Barboot's lodgings. Being Sunday, a great squall on deck between Mr. Charrington, who was the Army surgeon, and Captain Browne, who was the ship's captain and was not of relation to her. It began about the loss of some water gruel and ended with the great favor I had received to have my cabin in the steerage, which was an undesirable location on the ship. Despite her disdain for her quarters aboard ship, Browne's accommodations were far superior to those available for regular soldiers and camp followers. Space was extremely limited, as you can imagine, below deck on a ship like the London, with as many as 10 men allowed a berth measuring 6 feet square that left soldiers no choice but to take turns sleeping. Camp followers, including soldiers' wives and sutlers, resided among the soldiers, further cramping the space. In order to minimize illness, the berths and bedding were cleaned and aired out daily, fresh air was pumped between the decks, and vinegar was used as a disinfectant. With such crowded conditions aboard ship for lengthy periods of time, it is not surprising that passengers spent a lot of time above deck when permitted. Soldiers were kept busy aboard ship with various tasks, including assisting the sailors, fishing, and mounting guard. Idle hands were kept to a minimum among the rank and file to maintain order and discipline among the troops. Officers and their civilian equivalents, however, did have a lot of time on their hands. After a couple of months living aboard the London, Browne gives us a glimpse into the leisure time activities that in many ways characterized the British middling ranks during this period. She writes, "I this day began to work a pair of catgut ruffles." One of the basic distinctions between the lower orders and those above them in the social hierarchy in 18th century British society was manual labor. Those below the middling ranks were characterized by the work they did with their hands. While some members of the middling ranks did work with their hands like artisans and professionals, theirs was considered skilled labor, as opposed to the unskilled labor of farmers, street cleaners, or soldiers. As sailors kept the ship in working order, the passengers, like Browne, passed the time in ways suited to their rank. So when she says she worked a pair of catgut ruffles, this was an ornamental skill like embroidery that was often acquired and honed by young women of the middling and upper ranks. And as you can see in this image, ruffles were an elegant addition to gowns attached to the sleeve at the elbow. And they really were not for any type of labor. They were very ornamental, very fragile. But Browne's choice of material is a very interesting selection. Catgut is a tough, thin cord made from the treated and stretched intestines of certain animals, especially sheep, and used for, among other things, surgical ligatures. In comparison, the finest ruffles that graced the elbows of the elite would have been made of expensive, delicate lace that would have only been appropriate for special occasions, such as dances or court appearances. As I mentioned, they're really not for any type of physical labor. The source of Browne's unorthodox ruffle material came from the hospital supplies available aboard ship. Although she used a material that was inferior to fancy lace, her ruffles would have achieved the same look as their more expensive counterparts. Her position and rank not only allowed her access to hospital supplies, but also provided her with the leisure time and skills to create an ornamental addition to her wardrobe, which her maid later steals from her. So after about over 4 months, I think, aboard ship, which must have been quite tedious. I don't know how many ruffles she ended up making. Browne arrived in Alexandria, Virginia on March 23rd of 1755 and expressed relief at finally ending her foray at sea. She writes, "I now think myself very happy that I am at liberty once more, having been a prisoner in that wooden world called the London." Browne took up lodging in a private residence in the town, although this was difficult considering the size of the army and numbers of officers needing proper lodging. This was when Alexandria was a very fledgling town. According to Parliament's annual Mutiny Act, members of the British Army could be housed in private residences and inns or taverns as long as the owners consented and were compensated. With little housing available, officers primarily found lodging in private and public houses, while regular soldiers set up tents and encampments located on the outskirts of town. Being of a pseudo rank in the army, Browne was thus able to stay in more comfortable places than female camp followers who would have slept in tents, makeshift huts, or simply on the ground. Her arrangements, however, did not always live up to her ideals. She writes, "Mayor Carlisle's lady came to see me, but I was at a loss to seat her. Not having a chair in the house, she sent home for 3. Having received a visit from one of the prominent women of Alexandria, Browne could not properly seat her, which was an event that was almost certainly embarrassing. This may be why she moved to a new room 2 days later that had 3 chairs, a table, a case to hold liquor, and a tea chest, items that would better suit any more visits from the ladies of the town." And Mayor Carlisle's lady was Sarah Fairfax Carlisle. She was a very important person in Virginia. She was a member of the powerful Fairfax family that owned most of the land in Virginia, and wife of John Carlisle, a Scottish merchant and leading figure in Alexandria society. And you can actually visit the Carlisle house in Alexandria today. Mrs. Carlisle was around 5 months pregnant and had a son, William, who was 21 months old at the time. So children were likely a topic of conversation between the two mothers, particularly because Browne had just received word from her family back in London. "Words cannot express my joy. Received a letter from England, being the first since I left them. My dear children, and all were well, my mind much more at ease." In May of 1755, Browne prepared to depart Alexandria and embark on Braddock's march to take Fort Duquesne. Of the 407 wagons acquired for the march, 1 was assigned to the matron of the hospital, and she writes during her preparations, "Most of this day spent in making a tilt for my wagon, which is to be my bedchamber on my march to Will's Creek." While a wagon may not seem like a glamorous way to travel or place to sleep, it is very significant that Browne was allotted one. They were typically used for moving supplies, such as food, tents, or ammunition, and they were not generously provided, nor were they always in abundance. Even officers who traveled on horseback often had to share a wagon to carry their personal supplies. Those among the lower ranks of the Army, both men and women, did not have the luxury of horse or wagon and had to travel by foot. Soldiers carried their personal effects on their backs, as did their wives. As she set off on the march, Browne's position as matron garnered certain privileges, like having her own wagon, when compared to most of the other women with the Army. Her position in the line of march, however, did not reflect this prestige. She writes, "At 6 we marched for Wills Creek with 1 officer, my brother, self, and servants, 2 nurses, 2 cooks, and 40 men to guard us, 12 wagons with the sick, lame, and blind. My wagon is in the rear." Even within her own small section of hospital staff and supplies, Browne was physically placed last. She was obviously not pleased about this situation and writes of her coachman's shared displeasure with her location. "At break of day, the drum beat. I was extremely sleepy, but got up and we marched. But my wagon being in the rear the day before, my coachman insisted that it was not right that Madame Browne should be behind, and if they did not give way, they should feel the soft end of his whip. He gained his point and got in front." One of Browne's servants had to reinforce that despite her gender, she held a superior rank over the regular soldiers. Military hierarchy was typically reflected through the line of march. Whether Browne maintained her position at the front when her small hospital contingency joined the rest of the Army's line of march is doubtful. Her superior rank may have bothered the regular soldiers more than that of the officers, yet she was able to assert her position, albeit within the medical section of the Army. The original hospital staff that Browne had traveled with from England was the same staff she had worked with while serving at Louisburg. The hospital hierarchy, therefore, was well established, including Browne's authority within that association. And the fact that it's literally the same people that are now part of the General Hospital again during the next war. I mean, it's always astounding studying this period how like everybody seemed to know each other and kept, sort of reuniting or running into each other in very extraordinary circumstances. The roads on the way to Wills Creek were hastily constructed by the Army and continued to worsen as the line of march moved deeper into the frontier. And opportunities for lodging diminished, and so Browne was obliged to sleep in her wagon if she wanted any sort of privacy. But even this, having a wagon to sleep in, having something to sleep inside of, was a cause for concern among some of the officers. She writes, "Mr. Faulkner ordered a sentinel to be at my wagon all night so that no one should molest me." The wilderness was seen as a dangerous, uncivilized place through a British lens. This environment, combined with a multitude of uncivilized men from the lower ranks, could prove disastrous for the handful of women accompanying the Army. Browne's combined rank and gender allowed her protection from potential misfortune, an advantage she and the officers' wives had over the soldiers' wives and other women of the lower ranks who likely had to fend for themselves in cases of sexual assault. After 12 days of difficult traveling, Browne arrived at Wills Creek, which is in current western Maryland, the location of Fort Cumberland, and the rendezvous point for the British Army and its colonial reinforcements before heading off to face the French at Fort Duquesne. Browne described her new location as the most desolate place I ever saw, and her accommodations: "I was put into a hole that I could see daylight through every log and a porthole for a window, which was as good a room as any in the fort." The conditions at Fort Cumberland, which was a truly frontier outpost, were perhaps the most primitive Browne had yet encountered, and almost immediately she became ill with dysentery, which was termed the flux or bloody flux in the 18th century, due to the poor sanitary conditions at Fort Cumberland. The illness prevented Browne from writing in her journal for over 2 weeks. When she returned to her writing, both her brother and maid had also fallen ill, and there were reports of Indians scalping several families within 10 miles of us. Several families left their homes and came to the fort for protection. The Franco-Indian Army, stationed at the British Army's objective, Fort Duquesne, were well aware of the encroaching forces amassing at Fort Cumberland. They were absolutely tracking this army as it moved. The British Army confronted the realities of war on July 9, 1755, when the rank and file, led by General Edward Braddock, was soundly defeated by the French and a highly effective multi-ethnic native coalition at the Battle of the Monongahela. Within 3 hours, Braddock's forces of around 1,400 troops were devastated by around 500 to 600 native warriors and around 200 French Marines and police. 2/3 of Braddock's army had been killed or wounded, including much of the officer corps. Female camp followers accompanying the army were also among the dead. One French eyewitness of the native warriors that day recorded, "They came like foxes, attacked like lions, and fled like birds." Browne received news of the defeat 2 days after the battle. She writes, "It is not possible to describe the distraction of the poor women for their husbands. I packed up my things to send, for we expected the Indians every hour. My brother desired me to leave the fort, but I am resolved not to go, but share my fate with him." Braddock's defeat created massive disorder as the army attempted to regroup at Fort Cumberland and flee eastward to Philadelphia. And it was in the midst of this chaos that Browne's brother, Robert Bristow, died of dysentery. "Oh, how shall I express my distraction this unhappy day at 2 p.m, deprived me of my dear brother, in whom I have lost my kind guardian and protector, and am now left a friendless exile from all that is dear to me." Continuing to suffer from the same illness that killed her brother, Browne remained among the chaos of Fort Cumberland for a month, eventually joining the scattered army on the march to Philadelphia after purchasing a horse. She met up with part of her hospital contingent in Frederick, Maryland, where she awaited the arrival of the Army's remaining sick from Fort Cumberland and recovered from her severe illness. She stayed in Frederick for about a month, and then her official duties resumed as she and her colleagues prepared to depart for Philadelphia. Browne was set to accompany the wagons loaded with infirm soldiers, but separated from the hospital caravan at the request of her colleague, the surgeon, John Charrington, who she knew well from not just this campaign, as I mentioned, but also from being at the Fortress Louisburg. Browne seemed pleased to travel with Charrington, who proved to be an effective male advocate. It would be difficult for her to travel alone as a woman. As they journeyed into Pennsylvania, although she attempted to maintain physical space between herself and her escort as a way to express her status as a virtuous widow. These two have a fascinating relationship, and I really wish I could, definitively read between the lines between these two to figure out what was actually going on. So Charrington rode in a chaise, and Browne traveled on horseback, so she wasn't even in the same vehicle as him. Browne's attempt to exude a professional and friendly, not romantic relationship between her and Charrington on their first day traveling toward Philadelphia had no effect on the couple who provided lodging for them that night. So she writes, "We supped and desired to have 2 beds, but the mistress of the house said she presumed we were man and wife, and that one would do. Mr. Charrington said, it was true I was his wife, but it was very seldom that he was favored with part of my bed. She said she was sorry for it, and at last complied." So it was easier for Mr. Charrington to fabricate a story about why he and Browne needed separate accommodations as husband and wife than to try to explain why they would be traveling together if they were not married. So although they had to stretch the truth about their relationship to acquire appropriate sleeping arrangements, Browne, as the fairer sex, benefited from Charrington's negotiation when she was favored with a bed of down and Mr. Charrington with one of straw. So she got the better end of the deal. Browne and Charrington arrived at Philadelphia on October 18th of 1755. They sought lodging across the river at the Indian King, which is also still there in New Jersey, where they encountered what was becoming a common occurrence. Browne reports, "The people of the house stared at me, and some said I was Mr. Charrington's wife, and others his miss, but he soon convinced them that I was neither, and then they treated me with much more respect." The following day, Browne reported to the hospital where she received a room for the duration of her stay in Philadelphia. The winter of 1755 to 56 was a contentious political time for Pennsylvania's ruling assembly that was dominated by Quakers. Their pacifist beliefs prevented them from organizing defense for their colony's citizens, many of whom remained vulnerable in the vast backcountry of Pennsylvania following Braddock's defeat. Browne observed several events in Philadelphia marking the fight between those who sought protection through defense and those who opposed violence and war. Although she and the army sought refuge in Philadelphia for their winter quarters, fearful news of encroaching war parties composed of French soldiers and native warriors appear frequently in Browne's journal passages. She writes, "An express has arrived with an account that the Indians have burnt a town within 40 miles of us, and that they would soon be here, which news had no effect on the Quakers, for they still say they will not take up arms. The assembly met, but to no purpose, for they will not do anything to defend themselves." In an effort to bring more support for defense, Browne witnessed an act of political propaganda involving victims of one of the attacks on Pennsylvania's frontier settlements. She writes, "I went to the State House to see 2 men and a boy that were brought into town dead, scalped by the Indians. It was the dismalest sight I ever saw." So they actually brought in these people and had people go through the State House to see them. It was just an extraordinary act of political propaganda. The reports and events that Browne was privy to eventually resulted in the Quaker assemblymen stepping down from their positions in order to allow for defensive measures to be enacted. Backlash against Quaker pacifism during the French and Indian War also erupted in London, where there were attacks on Quaker-owned shops in the city in February of 1756 for remaining open on a fast day, and a Quaker woolen draper had his windows and shutters broken for not illuminating during a night of public celebration in June of 1759. As she grappled with the contentious news related to the war, Browne maintained a balance between her duty as the Army's matron working for the hospital and her role as a middling woman, hosting and visiting the ladies of Philadelphia and the Army. It's just it's such a fascinating duality of her roles, and she hardly ever writes about working in the hospital because it wasn't fit to write about. So she loves to talk about who she was hanging out with and what she ate or her furniture and things like that. It's really, really interesting. And her most frequent companion during this leg of her journey was Deborah Franklin, wife of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin and Browne had similar backgrounds as middling women who made contributions to their respective families through their work in fields dominated by men, with Franklin and her husband's printing business, and Browne in the Army. Franklin served as Browne's guide to Philadelphia Middling Society as they toured the city in Franklin's chaise. They dined at the Franklin's residence, they toured the academy, which would later be called the University of Pennsylvania, and socialized with Franklin's many prominent acquaintances. And also in Philadelphia, on December 1st of 1755, Browne heard from her family in London. She writes, "I received a letter from England and had the agreeable news that my brother was married and a prospect of his being happy." But this, of course, was a bittersweet piece of news for Browne, who no longer had her only kin connection with her on her journey, and whose hope for a speedy return to her family had diminished as her first year in the current conflict with France drew to a close. She had yet to realize that this was only the beginning of this defining chapter in her life as the war steered the Army north. The impact of Braddock's defeat was so huge. Browne, I believe, and the British Army never expected it to blow up into such a huge war. I think they thought maybe she'd be away for a year or two, but it ended up being much, much longer. So on February 13th, 1756, Browne reports very busy packing up, having received orders to march to New York. So she's following the war now with the Army. After a brief but stimulating stop in the city of New York, Browne accompanied British troops as they sailed up Hudson's River toward Albany, a trip she found enchanting. So even in the midst of this, she finds moments that are positive. And she writes, "We were soon enclosed with rocks, which was the most romantic scene I ever saw, being at a loss to tell the mountains from the clouds." Shortly after arriving in Albany, Browne went out to see the town, which is inhabited by the Dutch, saw several Indians who were adorned with beads in their noses and ears and black blankets, being in mourning for their friends who were killed in the last campaign. On a broad level, the French and Indian War has been referred to as a clash of cultures that involved British, colonial, French, Canadian, and many different American Indian interests. What Albany represented was a clash of cultures at an additional level within a specific city that had a specific ethnic and cultural identity within British North America, which was disrupted by the introduction of other different cultures that were also part of the ever-expanding, ever-changing British Empire. Albany's colonial foundations as the Dutch trading post, Fort Orange, had always included a substantial population of American Indians, particularly during trading season. This was in the 17th century. Trade fundamentally changed those indigenous cultures that inhabited the area of what became New York, as well as those who traveled great distances to trade at a place like Fort Orange or Albany. Browne's comments on the mourning practices of the American Indians she observed in Albany refer specifically to Native allies of the British, but also broadly to the situation of all natives whose settlements fell within British and French claims along the eastern seaboard and stretched to the Great Lakes region. In April of 1756, those American Indians she saw who walked the streets of Albany in mourning for their friends chose to fight for the British in hopes that if the British should win the war, their assistance and sacrifice in the war effort would be recognized through retention of land and regular trade. However, Native alliances were not always consistent throughout the war. Many tribes were wary of the French or British due to mixed experiences with treaties and trade practices. For example, while fully aware of the laws that forbade the trade of furs between French Canada and the British colonies, Albany merchants worked with many American Indians to smuggle furs from Canada into Albany, their ultimate destination in North America being the port of New York. But part of this process, and a point of pride for many Albany merchants, involved the Indians being cheated in disposing their goods, especially when they are drunk, and this is an actual account, a written account, and that sometimes they do not get 1/2 or even 1/10 of the value of their goods. The natives that Browne mentioned had participated in the northern campaigns of 1755, specifically the Battle of Lake George on September 9th of that year, which involved a costly British victory. Many of the British Army's Mohawk allies were killed, including Chief Hendrick Theanagian, the veteran of more than a half-century of warfare and diplomacy. This engraving of Chief Hendrick shows him wearing the coat of a British officer, a symbol of his alliance with the British and his position as a leader, and holding a belt of wampum in one hand while raising a tomahawk in the other, indicative of his roles as diplomat and warrior. So in addition to observing these natives when she first arrives in Albany, she also came prepared with letters of recommendation from Dr. Samuel Bard of New York, which was a formality of the middling and upper ranks that provided Browne with the appropriate credentials to be introduced to a circle of her peers in a new and unfamiliar place, particularly as a single woman. Her letters presented those to those at the fort in Albany were sufficient proof of her status and her role within the Army to those associated with the British Army. Yet, Browne became, as we've seen, when this single lady shows up places, people have many assumptions about her. She became the subject of swirling, scandalous rumors that spread throughout the community of Albany. She writes, "The Dutch had a very bad opinion of me, saying I could not be good to come so far without a husband." She had been quickly welcomed into the community and social gatherings of ranked members of the British Army, but her reputation among the Albany Dutch required correction from her colleagues, particularly that old acquaintance I mentioned earlier in the presentation from Louisburg. "Miss Miller came to see me. She told me that the Dutch said I was General Braddock's miss," basically General Braddock's mistress, "but she had convinced them that I was not, and that nobody could say anything bad of me." And this apparently restored her reputation because she soon writes, "Several of the Dutch ladies came to see me and gave me invitations to their houses." So it's interesting of we have this huge war going on and then this sort of petty drama in terms of, social rank and all these really fascinating things at play that get revealed by her account. As the season transitioned into spring and then summer, the war began to heat up along the frontier of New York, and the summer of 1756 was a time of remarkable contrast for Browne and the town of Albany. On June 12, 1756, she writes, "A girl taken by the Indians just out of town. All the fort ladies came to see me." This passage not only demonstrates the atmosphere of fear and paranoia that existed in Albany at this point, but also the support network of women working and residing at the fort in Albany, likely British women who accompanied the Army across the Atlantic to America as Browne had. Only 2 days later, Browne writes of a gathering of a different nature. "I received an invitation to go a mile out of town with Colonel Glazier and Miss Miller, but were obliged to have a guard with us for fear of the Indians. We went to see a Dutch officer's lady and were kindly received. We drank tea and then had a fine regale with sweetmeats, strawberries, butter, and cheese, which is the Dutch custom. We returned at night in safety." Preparations by the British Army for major campaigns in 1756 had been delayed by an overturn in leadership of His Majesty's forces in North America. General William Shirley, commander since Braddock's death in July of 1755, was relieved of duty by John Campbell, 4th Earl of Loudoun. As Albany awaited the arrival of the Army's new commander-in-chief, Loudoun's second in command, Major General James Abercrombie, stepped onto the shore of Albany, accompanied by reinforcements who had journeyed with the fresh leaders from the mother country to reinforce the provincial garrisons preparing for the upcoming expedition against the French at Crown Point. In addition to regular and provincial troops, negotiations for native support of the Crown Point campaign proceeded with delegates of the Haudenosaunee and Onondaga. These negotiations wrapped up in Albany in mid-July of 1756, and Browne was included in this process, if only on the sidelines. She writes, "I received an invitation to go to General Johnson's to see the Indians dance." General Johnson was William Johnson, the recently commissioned colonel, agent, and sole superintendent of the affairs of the Six Nations, their allies, and dependents. Johnson had overseen a great meeting, as he called it, that had resulted in, and I quote him, "a subsequent treaty with the Shawnee and Delaware Indians at my house in the presence of the Six Nation delegates." Browne had been invited to witness a war dance celebrating the success of the treaty at Johnson's Albany home, located at Market and State Streets. Yet despite these efforts, The campaigns of 1756 did not lead to any decisive victories and ensured that the war would drag on into the following year. In addition to pessimistic reports of the war and the precarious situation of Albany as a potential point of attack by the French, Browne was dealt a personal blow on August 10, 1756, that would leave her reeling. This is really hard to read. She writes, "This unhappy day, I received an account of the death of my dear child Charlotte, in whom my soul was centered. God only knows what I suffer. When shall I die and be at rest?" So just in the midst of so much going on, she finds out her daughter died. This news was further compounded by the departure of Browne's closest and most constant companion throughout her journey in North America. She writes, "Mr. Charrington left Albany for England, in whom I have lost all my friends in one." In January of 1757, Browne writes, "Received orders to remove to the hospital, which was no better than a shed, and it was so excessive cold that my face and neck were frostbitten in moving." Albany winters are no joke. By August 4th, 1757, almost a year to the day since she had heard of her daughter's death, Browne deliberately ends her journal. And this is the last page. You can see she just cuts it off, but this is her final passage. She writes, "An express has arrived from General Webb at Fort Edward to the commanding officer, who says that Fort Henry is besieged with 1,100 French and desires that expresses may be sent to New York and New England for all the assistance they can send. I here end my journal, having so much business on my hands that I cannot spare time to write it." The final year of her journal includes not one mention of social activity, only news of fear and loss, both personal and having to do with the war. While Browne's own account of Albany during the French and Indian War ends in August of 1757, her time in Albany did not. She remained throughout the duration of the conflict and did not return to London until 1763. She had been separated from her surviving children for 9 years. Yet she, along with the help of her family members, had supported their upbringing despite her lack of physical presence in their young lives. Like so many women of her time throughout the British Empire, Browne devoted her life to upholding her role as an ideal British middling woman, only she attempted to do so through extraordinary circumstances of widowhood and war. She died in London in 1773 at the age of 49. Thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions there might be from those here or online. It's a sad story, but I find her fascinating.
Is that the only account that you have?
That's the only account that I know of that she wrote, yeah. I found when I was in Albany, I went to SUNY Albany, that's where my PhD is from. So I did a lot of research at, the New York State Library and their archives there. Unfortunately, a ton of the British Army's records from this period were lost in a horrible fire at the state capitol in the early 20th century. The Dutch stuff survived because nobody knew how to read it, so it was like sort of on the bottom shelves. But there are a few pieces that, some of it's a little charred. And I found lists of supply lists from the hospital in Albany that look like her handwriting. So that, I think I may have found something that could have been in her hand, but it's a really, when I first sat down waiting for it at the Library of Congress, I just went, man, because I wasn't the only one that knew about this account. but no one had really done much with it. And I thought, oh geez, is this just gonna be really boring? Like, is there really anything in it? And I couldn't believe what was in such a short period of time that she was able to share. And it to me is just really, and these are just bits and pieces of what she wrote. So it's great, you can go online and see the one that's at the New York Historical Society. And it was also published in a book in the early 20th century called Colonial Captivities, Marches, and Journeys by Isabel Calder, which has some other transcribed accounts in it too. So there are some areas where you can access it and read the whole thing. It doesn't take long, it's really not that long, but boy, is there some interesting stuff in there, and just these little leads to try to, piece together her life and experience and who was around her and what was happening.
Nothing in the chapter.
I was really struck by the artwork, the portraits, and the incredible personalities that were in many of them. And I think it was Alan Ramsey's 1750 portrait, and the way you described her and her portrait, an incredible strength, an incredible, well, this is who I am, and I don't care what you think, kind of attitude in that portrait. And so I think that, I just wanted to comment on that. I think the choices, even this one, the portrait on the face, and it really, truly amazing. And a lot of the other, not so much the one where, the battle, et cetera. It's really hard to dissect. But certainly the attitudes and the attitudes of social class, right? I mean, you mention classes, but oftentimes underlying is that attitude toward the poor, right? The workers, who always, to this day, are denigrated in some way. So I just want to comment, I think this is really interesting, and maybe one question, not that I would put a lot of weight in this for a lot of reasons, but are there any secondary accounts of her life by some of these good, Deborah, her good friend, or some others who might have made comments about, not mean bad comments, but comments about her life that might shed a little bit about her personality? Because even if you want to honor your duties as a middling or upper class person, woman in particular, to move forward away from your children is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I have yet to find, even amongst her close circles, if there is some sort of mention of her, the only records I've found her name listed, aside from her final will and testament, and the family Bible that lists her children and when they were born and where they were born, is in the 18th century Army lists, which list officers' commissions, which she wasn't technically a commissioned officer, but she certainly had a civilian rank in the Army, and she certainly was socially ranked and within the Army ranked above the female camp followers who were typically soldiers' wives or related to a soldier in some way. So that to me was pretty cool that she's listed as the matron. And this is also a time where they're really starting to centralize the British Army's structure too, and it was the first time there was a centralized general hospital, and why they chose a team of people, including her, that were experienced and could sort of travel and move, and then they situated that general hospital in Albany. I mean, they were sending wounded soldiers from Cuba there. That was how it was considered so central, which seems a bit awry. And also I love how you brought up that the importance of her social rank, because when I first was talking to some historians in my early 20s, when I was first embarking on my journey as a historian, and figuring out if I should pursue a PhD and sort of having this source and not knowing what to do it. And knowing some really wonderful historians of the Braddock campaign, like Paul Copperman, that I had the privilege to be able to talk to and have discussions about her. And he and a lot of male historians, because again, as Hayden mentioned in the intro, a lot of this history has been written by men, it's been written by the victors, even throughout much of the 20th century, and that he just had always assumed she was of the lower ranks because she was with the army. And I said, oh no, she's way too many clothes. She talks a lot about the clothes and the trunks she has. She's way too many clothes to be able to be of the lower ranks. And so that became the thesis of like, how do I establish that there was a hierarchy among women socially within the army as well, beyond just officers' wives versus soldiers' wives. She was their boss. Like, the female camp followers would be assigned to the hospital as nurses, or they'd be doing laundry. Those were like the primary things. Very important roles, support roles, keeping the army clean and healthy, right? But she was their boss. There absolutely was that hierarchy, both in the hospital, in the army, and just socially. And she couldn't have gotten that job if she was a soldier's wife. It just does not seem to fit the role of matron in 18th century, the British world. Yeah, it's very, very interesting stuff.
It just shows how important the journal is. She didn't keep that journal that was female account.
Yeah, and I love when she talks about the aftermath of Braddock's defeat and how she is specifically talking about how worried the women are because their husbands were in that battle, and how many of them came back, how many actually found each other. And we talk about that battle and the tactics, which are fascinating, and we're still learning more about it, like thanks to people like David Preston's latest work, Braddock's Defeat, which I highly recommend because he finally delved into more of like the French sources, which revealed new like native information too. And so I think having like all of these things really, and he includes Charlotte Browne in that, and that there were women at that battle, which was rare for women to be caught in the firefight. And it's just so fascinating. And yeah, I'm so grateful for her account. And yeah, we focus on the battle, but we don't think about the aftermath. They talk about the chaos and having to go to winter quarters in July, and because of sort of what happened to all the officers, but my gosh, like that, she was at Fort Cumberland for a month, and they were being pursued. I mean, they didn't know what was gonna happen. So I love those moments that you wouldn't get in like an Army record, an Army account necessarily, and where we're learning how those women must have been feeling. Yeah, it's amazing.
Can I piggyback on that? Do you know, because I don't, unfortunately, about literacy in that age, and I'm assuming, unfortunately, that often literacy was higher for men and women because women weren't educated, and just like for the lower classes, they weren't educated either, right?
Yes, yes.
So
Literacy was
intentionally
lower.
so, which I won't go on with my fury about that, but I was just curious about that because the journal is very important.
Yeah.
Very, very important. And if you
Yeah.
have to be able to keep a journal and
Yes,
I
the
was just
idea
curious.
of literacy
Yeah.
and women was the question. And yeah, I definitely delve into that in my dissertation about, we're seeing a start of a rise of more women being able to read, but of course it is usually based on social rank. To be able to read and write. We see things like the Richardsonian seduction novels being written specifically for women. Finally, there's an audience that they're pinpointing. But even if some of those soldiers' wives knew how to read and write, what's your access to the materials to do so when you're on the march with General Braddock's army, out into the middle of nowhere, and you have to carry everything you have. So how how do you actually write even if you can? And so that's absolutely like another distinction. And the idea of material culture and just the literal stuff of your everyday life when you're in the middle of a war, based on gender and social rank, is very, very different. And without this account and without some more research that's been being done of sort of, finding these mentions of women, a lot of times the only time women would be written about in British Army records was because they did something wrong. So then you think, oh, well, all of these women must have been like prostitutes and thieves, and like they weren't. Like you're like, this is, you don't just want to like join the army, you have certain circumstances where you end up. Even Charlotte Browne, like she's really doing this. I mean, I'm sure there was a sense of duty to her country, based on her previous experience and just being like a proud Briton. But she had to support her children. What are your options? And that's always what I'm looking at as a gender historian, particularly with women's histories, what are your options? Like, what is your circumstance? What are your options based on like your physical location, but then all these other things that are so well defined in terms of the culture of each social rank and the expectations of those. It's endlessly fascinating.
Do you know if she had any guys assigned to her to like load her luggage or repair her wagon or?
I mean, she seemed to have some support. I mean, she had her own maid with her, which is again indicative of her rank. Who she fires at one point and then has to get another because she steals from her. But she certainly, I think, had, and you could see how her coachman's sort of standing up for her, and they're putting a sentinel at her wagon. I think she did have a lot of support around her until there's the chaos and the aftermath of Braddock's defeat, and just her trying to write about having to buy a horse. I'm like, where did you buy, like, where do you even have your money? And like, where do you find a horse to buy at Fort Cumberland in the aftermath of Braddock's defeat, like a month later? And then she's literally like so weak from being sick that she couldn't even like direct the horse, and the horse ends up wandering up to a house where somebody she knows is there. I mean, it's, so her circumstances vary greatly, and it's because of, again, her circumstance of where is she physically at, what's happening around her, what is her social rank. But war is just going to blur those lines at different points. It's going to break it down. I mean, war is a time where people are expected to do things that are not acceptable in regular, everyday society, right? And so that was the interesting thing for me, of where she is desperately trying to maintain like her gender and rank in these circumstances that are just trying to break them down. Yeah, it's really interesting. So she often has help and has like, there are gentlemen trying to help the lady, But I don't know how common that was for like the soldiers' wives. They're the last one to get a 10, They're just sort of, they're there to help, but they're not, they're considered like baggage, and literally. Yeah.
And then, like in the men when they correspond with each other, they usually write like your humble servant. Did the women do stuff like that?
I mean, you see her sort of using like some of the phrasing where I'm like, oh my gosh, are you just being like real shady about this person? Like throwing shade. I mean, you sort of can find within, and I think like Hamilton showed that well, like the musical Hamilton of the letters, and how that could be used in sort of, it was a gentlemanly way, but also they would use this very like flowery language to really try to get at somebody, right, too. So you see that kind of at play too, where she's kind of making some like innuendos or like different, things that I think she's trying to be funny, about a circumstance of so-and-so fought with this person about this, and it was like so silly, but like, she's using this like amazing language that's very much along the lines of your most humble and obedient servant. Yeah, it's fun to read and start to try to figure out, the culture of the language that the written language too. Yeah.
And then I just had Just want to make a comment, like, say, a native perspective on it. When you said they were trying to get the Quakers to throw the defense, and so they bring in these bodies, I guess, that were
Yeah.
found, and claiming that the natives did that.
Right.
I'll bet you anything, the British themselves either killed them people or found them and scalped them and brought them in and said, this is what the natives are doing, we gotta.
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, who knows? And it is really interesting when she's only saying it's the Indians too, when it's the French also, you know, it's like the French also, but like, yeah, is that actually what happened? Or are they like, hey, here's an opportunity for us to really try to push our agenda here? Yeah, I mean, there could be so much to read into that. And if you have any sources that could help me sort of navigate, you know, some of those scenarios, you know, I'm always looking for things like that because, and it's also interesting too because she sort of will just say like the Indians attacked blah 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 outside of town, but then she does talk about being amongst parties which she calls friendly Indians, and that stuff I really want to delve into more too, of like, okay, well, who are they, like what group are they part of, like what tribe, like how do we figure out the movements of those groups, which alliance they had as well. And that's something I want to do more as I continue working on this to potentially turn it into a book. Because those are the fun puzzles to try to, which I think can be pieced together too. And will be very worthwhile as we try to create that common memory of this era, right? Well, if there aren't any other questions, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to Hayden for having me here at this wonderful museum. And please come visit me in Greensburg sometime, or maybe I'll see you up here in Salamanca.